Hey there, welcome, or maybe welcome back to our AZ-801 Configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. In this module, we're continuing the path maybe, or you might join for the first time, but not all that important for now. It's all going to be about securing Windows Server on-premises and hybrid infrastructure, where for this module, it's mainly focusing on the hybrid piece, meaning how to use Azure capabilities, Azure security features, to really optimize the security of your Windows virtual machines, which obviously are running in Azure at that moment in time. Now, if this is the first module you're joining, know that throughout the different modules of the course, we always start with a module touching on the Windows Server on-premises capabilities primarily, and then the follow-up or the second module, if you want, is covering about the same topic, like in this case, security, but then also zooming in on what it looks like from an Azure perspective. So if you need to follow on in that list, make sure that you understand a bit the concept, server first, and then moving into that hybrid cloud concept. So that, I would say, let's get started, right? Now, in this module, as you know, in meantime, it's all about protecting our servers running in the Azure environment, where we have a few different sections to cover. Now, the first section is all about network security. Now, what does it mean in short? A couple of highlights here. Obviously, first of all, when you think about Azure networking, it's about NSGs, or what we call network security groups, where I'm going to walk you through the concepts primarily, because it's not going to be a deep dive. There's so many more topics that we need to cover out of this course. So it's more like a recap, I would say, or maybe an introduction for some of you who are new to the topic, but know that we do have other learn mechanisms like learn.microsoft.com could help you finding more information, or specifically around network security, I could recommend our AZ-700 Azure Network Security classes. So we're going to start with NSG's network security groups, talking a little bit about the difference between NSGs and ASGs, or application security groups. It's basically firewalling concept in our Azure platform, and then touching a little bit on the two other options that we have in the platform to provide network security, which means Azure Firewall, but then also looking at it from a virtual machine host perspective, talking about the Defender security out of that Windows operating system firewall layer. And then closing the topic, talking about network monitoring using Network Watcher. Now, when you think about these network security groups, again, if you are doing anything with Azure, even if you only did some Azure foundational level, you probably know what NSGs are about. Simplifying it a little bit, it's really that software cloud-based firewall network traffic allowed blocking mechanism that we have in the platform. Now, there's a few different layers when you look at an Azure network topology, where it starts on a subnet. So the assumption is you deploy a virtual machine needs a network interface card, and you're going to define IP address information. Next to that, you're obviously going to allow and block certain traffic, preferably not just depending on what the server is about, but also what the server is actually running. Like an easy example here, we might have a virtual machine one, could be a web server, database server, domain controller, pretty much any kind of server functionality, and you're going to allow traffic from a web server VM1 into maybe a database server VM2. You're going to allow specific traffic, and you're going to block all other traffic. Now, I talked about the different topology options, which means that you could now define NSG rules like allowing and blocking incoming, outgoing traffic to the subnet level, like all virtual machines within the same subnet will use the same network rules, or you could define it on individual network interface card. My personal recommendation after using Azure for about 15 years is try to follow the subnet topology, just because it makes your life so much easier. You never know when you're going to add more servers, maybe you're going to remove servers, and that means you might need to think a bit more about what were the specific settings that we used for this server. Where now if it's on a subnet level, like my web server subnet, my database server subnet, that would make it a lot more logical. The counterpart, I would say, but not really different, is application security groups. So in short, what's the difference between an NSG and an ASG? NSGs are really touching on the rule base, like what kind of traffic am I allowing or blocking, or what kind of traffic can go in and out. Where now ASGs allow you to group settings of those NSGs, allocating, assigning virtual machines to a category of rules. Like in this example, it might be web servers connecting to, as you can see, SQL servers, where you could create an ASG configuration where inside the ASG, you're going to define an ASG for the web servers. What it means is that whenever you deploy a new virtual machine in Azure, you're going to allocate it to that ASG group. And that means it's immediately applying the ASG firewall ruling settings, technically coming out of the NSGs. So simplifying the diagram, you have a collection of web servers. They're all part of the web ASG. You have two SQL servers, and they're part of the SQL Server ASG, because obviously the rule base for web servers is different than database servers. And then everything else on the side, like the ERP, could be a more ERP business CRM-alike system, where again, you got different rule bases coming in. So that's in short what it looks like. Next option is not using NSGs. Every now and then, and I don't always agree with that feedback, but when I do classes on like Azure architecting, for example, then sometimes I get feedback from learners like, well, I think NSGs are a little bit too easy, too lightweight, maybe too limited compared to an on-prem network appliance from any possible vendor. So that's where I would say it's not just a counterpart for NSGs or ASGs, but it also allows you to build out more advanced, maybe more complex networking security layers. And that's where Azure Firewall comes in. The other difference is also, if you look at the network stack, you have different layers. You might look into something that we call the ISO model, and that's where you have different layers in the network stack. Now, typically, you have the transport layer, you got the application layer. When we talk about application servers, it's typically layer 7 in that OZ model. Now, layer 7 means that your traffic that's like literally passing through the wire, you could say, is aware about what kind of application. Is it SMTP for email? Is it FTP for file transfer? Is it HTTP for like a browser connection? That's really what that application layer stands for. We're now with our Azure Firewall, you can actually integrate security, not only allowing opening or closing ports, but you could also look into that layer 7. A little bit more, it's, for example, integrating web application firewall. So what it means is that you're going to integrate like intrusion detection, content inspection, like security on top of your Azure Firewall. If you have a somewhat more advanced network requirement or network security requirement, probably meaning if you have one of those big brand appliances in your on-prem network or hybrid, then maybe you could look into Azure Firewall as a counterpart. And that's mainly the message we would like to bring here. Apart from that, we also have Windows Firewall integrated in the operating system itself. Now, I know, again, over the years, if you were here from the start, I explained that I've been working with Windows servers NT4 like from summer 96, at least out of my professional career. So basically almost been working with Windows servers for about 30 years now. And at some point, I don't remember exactly which version of the operating system, but it brought in that Windows Firewall concept, really allowing you per virtual machine or physical probably at that time to really define network security settings. At the same time, although I think it's a brilliant solution, a lot of customers, one of the first things they do out of like group policies is disabling Windows Firewall. And I never really got that. Why? Because it's one of the easiest, baked in, free, even if you want, security mechanisms you have to really define what kind of network traffic am I allowing to and from my machine. So any network traffic layer, like any port you don't need on the server, you could immediately block out of that Windows Firewall. In another module, we also talked about compliance validations out of like a compliance validation toolkit. And that's also going to look into what firewall ports do you have open. Like simplifying it a bit, if you have a web server, but there's no database running on it, why would you open up database communication ports? So that's where the Windows Firewall, and officially it's now called Windows Defender Firewall, just following the name logic from all our other security platform capabilities. But in the end, it's a software-based firewall specifically for each and every host individually. And then going back to the group policies, you can obviously manage it, defining the rule base and then spreading the policies across different servers. Now, you got two screenshots up here, maybe not all that clear on the video, but nothing to worry about because I'm going to show you this in a live demo in just a little bit. Now, when you define network security options like defining network rules, defining firewall configuration options, you also need to think a little bit about filtering. Now, what does it mean filtering? As you can see, we typically talk about three different scenarios. First one, netting or network address translation, means that you're going to block certain IP addresses to go to the outside. You can define network rules and then eventually application rules. So what it means is you're going to allow or deny specific traffic. Like if you have a server that doesn't need to connect to the internet or you don't want any communication from the internet to the server, why would you open it up? That's really the reasoning here. But then within the server itself, you're going to look into the operating system layer, you're going to look into the application layer, and maybe even anything in between. And that's what we want to highlight here. That's mainly the first part where I'd like to introduce you to Azure networking security firewalling capabilities. So we touched on NSGs, talked about ASGs, talked about Azure Firewall. And I think with that, it's time for our first demo in this module, showing you a bit what NSGs and Azure Firewall can help you with. So in this demo, it's all about network security groups and primarily focusing on Azure Firewall. So to give you some idea about at least this part of my demo setup, because I'm not always using the same setup for all my demos in the course, I have a AZ-801 firewall resource group, as I called it, and within I have all my resources. Now this is deployed using a template, so I'm not really showing you how you can deploy something similar using the portal, but I guess most of you will probably use command line Azure CLI, maybe PowerShell script, or Bicep or Azure templates. Looking a little bit more on the lower level, like what do I have in my resource group? I have two different servers. So one of them is a jump server. Second one is the actual work server, as I called it. And the whole idea here is to create that privileged access workstation concept, meaning that I would not allow direct connection to my work server, but all administration should happen from the jump server, like a Bastion host, you could say. Which means that if I jump to my server, you can see that this one is connected to the public internet using a public IP, and it's part of a virtual network and a subnet that I called test firewall VNet and my jump server subnet. If I move over to the network settings, I can pull up more details about this server configuration, where then up here, I can again see my virtual network and subnet, and over here, my internal public IP address. We also have a network security group, and if we open this one up, it's what you see down here. Now, for now, since this setup is mainly relying on Azure Firewall, not really NSGs, I didn't really customize any of the default rules. Now, what do I mean by default rules? I have my network security group linked to my VNet and my subnet. Now, this one is attached to the subnet. So this means that all servers in this specific subnet will get those NSG rules applied. The default rules is what you find a little bit more below. They have low priority, or actually a high number, but that means that you have a whole range of custom policies, custom port rules you could add into it. But by default, the way NSGs work, it's allowing virtual network incoming communication. So this means that all traffic within the VNet is allowed. If we deploy load balancers in front of it for like clustering, traffic between the load balancer and the backend servers is allowed. And then from there, everything else will be denied. And the same for outgoing or outbound traffic. When I move a little bit more down, you can see that I do have a different NSG. This one is now called server jump NSG. And instead of my previous example, where the NSG was linked to the full subnet, this one is now linked to an individual and a network card. If we want to make changes to the ports, we can do that obviously inbound and outbound, where you can define, for example, like source can be pretty much anything. And let's say we're going to open up like a SQL MySQL port. You don't need to remember the ports because we select the service, it's going to add the ports. And next to that, we're just going to define the priority based out of that default list of 65,000. And that's, I would say, pretty much all we have to do from here. Now, one of the challenges I would say that you might face in a larger environment is obviously that NSGs could become pretty complex. As mentioned, sometimes we get feedback, they're a little bit too basic, maybe not going too deep enough. And that's where you can deploy firewall. So what I have here is my Azure firewall. And if you never deployed one, it's basically from the portal. If you use the portal, at least create new resource firewall, and it's going to ask you to go through a couple of different settings. So the highlight here is, obviously, since it's a firewall, it needs public IP addresses. I defined 2 of them just to have like some sort of a high availability. I can dive into Firewall Manager, and it's not that valid in my environment because I only have one firewall. But as you can see here, there's a few different firewalling security options, where right now we're mainly touching on Azure Firewall. So if I move to Azure Firewall here, I got my test resource belonging to that firewall resource group. And then you can see here, we're back at the start, but it's showing me more information. Couple of highlights, there's standard, and a recommendation here may be to move to premium. So I would say in a real world scenario, make sure you spend quite some time looking into all those details. The Azure firewall obviously needs its own subnet. It's connected to a public IP address, and it's running in its own private IP address range, which obviously in this case is different from my server 172.116 IP address range. Last item is the firewall policies and the rule base. So what is a firewall policy? As you can imagine, it's a set of rules that you're going to define where you specify the incoming, outgoing traffic. There's a new preview feature here that I would like to highlight for a second, where you can create a draft rule base, which means it's going to allow you to really build up the configuration, but you are not applying all the settings yet. Most important piece here is the actual rule base. And like I explained in the presentation, you could create a lot more advanced scenarios than what I have here. But this is overall default network rule and default application rule. If we look a little bit closer into the network collection rule, we have a priority where we allow, and it's linked to the network. And what we're allowing here is basically DNS traffic like port 53. If I move to my application rule collection, you're going to see that now this is different because it's allowing traffic for web applications. And in this case, it's an outgoing, so we only allow communication to go to like the Bing website. Another option is in the same collection group, we're now doing the same, but specifying only one protocol. And down here, we also specify the source servers, where in this case, it's the IP group that we have for our ports. From here, we do have more options, like we can specify specific network rules. And as you can see, these are the ones that you defined earlier, giving them a priority number, allowing DNS from the source, which port, and then what is the destination. And then the same for the application rules, where I already showed you the outcome. And you're going to create a collection of rules, or you're going to create rules and you're going to move them into a collection. That's mainly what this means. And then since it's a firewall, and again, my environment is not that impressive, but since network topologies are typically a little bit harder to interpret, I could recommend every now and then checking that resource visualizer, and that's going to give you quite some information. But then I think I talked enough about NSGs and showing the difference a little bit with Azure firewall policies, and going back to the presentation for the next part in the session. Good. Now with that, we talked about the configuration, but you probably know my statement already. Don't manage anything if you don't know what monitoring looks like. You don't know how to manage something, you don't know how to configure, reconfigure if you don't know the outcome. And that's where Azure gives you Network Watcher. Network Watcher is a built-in Azure service, which means you don't even have to deploy it. It's already there for you, and it allows you to monitor your Azure networking stack. You deploy it whenever you deploy an infrastructure service, like obviously a virtual machine in this example. In the back of the platform, it automatically enables Network Watcher for that specific region where you deploy the virtual machine. There's a lot of different capabilities, and we're going to touch on these a little bit more in depth in one of the other AZ-801 modules, where it's 100% about monitoring and troubleshooting, where I'm going to bring in a little bit of Network Watcher again. But in short, it's a monitoring tool, like I already mentioned, monitoring network traffic, network communication from one VM to another, and even across different endpoints. You could also use it for diagnosing, troubleshooting, getting metrics like what's the amount of traffic going in and out, which maybe could also point into a security problem, like somebody trying to, steal data, copying data, a cyber attack. So that where Network Watcher could be an easy solution to compare like the amount of network traffic that we see today, 9 o'clock in the morning, compared to like a week ago. And then eventually you could also create your dedicated Azure Network Watcher instance, and that's going to look into the full VNets and obviously roaming across your Azure network. Good, so that was all about Azure network security features. So with that, we're going to move on to our next section in this module, covering what it takes to audit the security of your Azure running virtual machines. Again, as always, we start a section with what are you going to learn about this section? So in short, it's going to cover Defender for Cloud, our Azure Security Posture Platform capability, together with Sentinel, which is what we describe as a SIEM and SOAR solution. And if you don't know what those acronyms stand for, then I would say make sure you follow through all the way to the end of the section, because that's really what we're going to talk about. Now, what is Defender for Cloud? I describe it as the security posture service or capability in the platform. Some time ago, like a few years ago, we had this service called Azure Security. Azure Security gave you that highlight, like what's the security state of my environment, and again, following the Defender branding, like really highlighting that security aspect of the tooling. That's where the Azure Security Center got also renamed to Defender for Cloud. It allows you, and our focus obviously is mainly on managing your virtual machines, but you'll find out that Defender can manage your security posture from anything that you run in the Azure platform. So it's not just the virtual machine layer. If you deploy app services, containers in Kubernetes, if you deploy Azure Functions, storage accounts, like whenever there is a potential security optimization possible, that's what Defender is going to warn you about. You're still in control. So what it means is that it's just going to give you a set of recommendations, and it's still up to you to like integrate the security optimizations or flagging them like, thanks for noticing, but I'm not going to use it. That's like really the mindset. Also keep in mind that Defender for Cloud, although it runs in Azure, it also allows you to bring in information from other cloud environments like AWS and Google Cloud. This here is a screenshot, and again, on the left side, there's a lot of capabilities, but you can imagine I got a demo coming up for that. But the screenshot is a good one because it really shows you like what we call the network topology view. So what's the idea? You deploy a virtual machine, and as always, looking at it from a security perspective, You want to know what's running on the server. You want to know what are the network connections from and to the server. And then also, is there any suspicious activity? Like if your machine is under attack, like a cyber attack, right? You could open up Defender and it's going to show you real time what's actually potentially going wrong with that machine. If the machine has like lateral movement is one of the security issues we typically talk about, which means that one virtual machine is infected and it's sending malware or cyber attacks to other devices in the network, then that topology view that you just get out of the box in the version of Defender for Cloud, it's going to immediately give you that split-second view what the security state of your environment looks like. But I would say enough talking about capabilities. I'm just going to switch to my next demo where I'm going to show you a bit about the difference, first of all, between the built-in Azure Defender for Cloud option, meaning the free edition that you get with a subscription, and highlighting that you can shift to a paid version as well. By the way, the paid version gives you more security capabilities. Next to that, talking a bit about how to integrate your virtual machine reporting back to the Defender for Cloud, and then also touching on that hybrid aspect, because again, it's not only for Azure running virtual machines or any other Azure resource, but also hybrid, and trying to show you that in my demo as well. So with that, let me walk you through a little bit of Defender for Cloud. So the first step is obviously showing you what that security posture looks like. So after just opening Defender for Cloud, as you can see, it's going to show you quite some information. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in another part of the demo later on. But you can identify your Azure subscriptions. You can immediately see how many resources within your environment are actually getting watched over by the Defender for Cloud. And then also any details on potential attack path, like maybe suspicious activity in our case, and then filtering a little bit on security alerts. Another interesting one is that it's going to give you a secure score, and it's not only for Azure workloads. So you can bring in, which I do not have in my demo environment, but you can bring in AWS, Google Cloud information from the resources or services over there into your Defender for Cloud, giving you that one single security view. If we move to the setup, that's where you would identify the different external sources to Defender for Cloud, like integrating AWS or Google Cloud based on the identity and subscription information. And as you can see, there's also additional environments where you can bring in like a little bit of DevSecOps or security for DevOps in a GitHub environment, GitLab, or Azure DevOps. Next question you might answer is like, okay, but how do I know which resources are getting monitored? So that's where you could move to the inventory. And again, for all resources within your Azure environment or hybrid AWS, Google Cloud, it's going to list them up and showing you in an immediate quick view over here, like what is the overall security state. Obviously, the more red color you see, if you can actually see that, it's going to highlight, and everything that's okay, flagged as no security risk, it's showing up in green. So that's an easy, quite straightforward view. Now, when we move back to our workload protection, you can see that over here, we have again the same split view, but touching a lot more on security capabilities. And then for now on the highlights, let me move to the management section here and showing you a bit on the overall environment settings. So what you, for example, can do here, like I talked about in the presentation, is defining how clients will onboard. So this is integration with Defender for Endpoint, where anything that runs in Azure obviously gets immediately detected by Defender for Cloud, but it might be a little bit more tricky for your non-Azure running workloads. And that's also where later on we'll talk a bit about Arc, like having a hybrid management service that's going to bring in your hybrid running on-prem or different cloud environments. workloads into an Azure mindset. So from here, I don't have them, but you would just enable it and then defining what kind of subscription pointing to your Defender for endpoints. So that should help you in getting some idea about how to manage your environment, where the last one I want to highlight here is governance. I'll talk a little bit more about governance later on, but that's actually compliance regulations that we can monitor. What we're doing here is actually moving towards that SIEM and SOAR that I talked about, not just using it in a proactive way, but actually also allowing you to really get an idea about what your environment looks like and then interacting with your security teams. So what it means is here you could create a first rule. Let's call this the demo rule, scoping it to my subscription. I'm going to give it a priority of 10. And then in the actual condition, you can define specific filters, like based on a severity, like low, medium, probably high, together with an owner. So this would be an email or a resource tag. And we want to send out notifications. So pretty easy. This is specific to Defender for Cloud. Obviously, you have the broader Azure alerts that you could also use, but we'll talk about those later on. So that's it for now, getting your Defender for Cloud up and running, integrating in a hybrid scenario, how to enable provisioning for non-Azure running workloads, and then from there, touching a little bit on the different pricing plans and how to check your inventory. Now, we talked about Azure Security Center. Now, one of the other capabilities, and you can argue if it's really security related, but I'm pretty confident to say that it is, it's what is the compliance state of my virtual machine? If you're in healthcare, if your organization is required to follow like the ISO 27001 standards or the PCI compliance, like if you're doing anything with payment, card industry, or like financial transactions, like all those different compliance regulations are valid for your on-prem data center. And if you start moving, migrating, deploying workloads in cloud, it means that most probably you still need to follow those compliance regulations. That's exactly one of the so many other features that we have in Defender for Cloud. So keep that in mind. You can imagine I got another little demo coming up for that later on. But in short, the way it works is you're going to open up your virtual machine. You hook it up into Defender for Cloud, which probably happens already automatically, as I showed you in the previous demo. And then from there, it starts reporting back. We have our Microsoft compliance baseline. That's part of the platform. And then from there, obviously, depending on your other compliance regulatory requirements, you can import the PCI one, the ISO 27001, and even a few other ones, like HIPAA is in there, and again, a few other. I don't remember all of them, but that's mainly how it works. The logic behind it is exactly the same as finding out like what's the security state of my server, where now it's going to report back based on Azure policies in the background, like what is the state, the compliance state in this case, of your virtual machine workload. And again, it's not just virtual machines, but that's just one of the so many use cases there. Another angle into the whole virtual machine security is obviously not only knowing what's happening, but also how to fix it. Now, out of that initial demo, out of Defender for Cloud, I mainly showed you the reporting piece, like the security posture aspect of it. But keep in mind that, again, you are also in control of mitigating the problem. Now, I'm emphasizing that you're in control, but technically I'll show you there's also a capability where you're going to interact with the platform using what we call a quick fix. It's literally just a click of a button, and that's going to run the fix for you, like maybe changing a setting in a storage account, maybe enabling something on the virtual machine level. And that's really what we wanted to highlight here. But I promised you another demo, and that's what I'm going to do here, showing you how to, again, connect to Defender for Cloud, just to go back to the portal, defining a bit what that policy and compliance regulatory configuration option looks like, picking out one of my many demo virtual machines, and then making sure that we can get to two connected, and showing you a bit on my imaginary less secure virtual machine, how it actually works from detection into mitigating the problem. So moving on here from my previous part of the demo, just giving you the highlight of what Defender for Cloud is about, where now it's a little bit more about actual protection capabilities. So I'm going to switch back to my portal, and there's a couple of different ways to navigate around, as you probably already know. So I could start from my inventory, selecting any of my resources. And again, what I didn't emphasize in the previous part is that obviously it's not just about virtual machines. So I could pick any of my VMs, but just giving you an idea, it also looks into Key Vault, storage accounts, Azure Arc for my hybrid servers, function apps, web apps, so pretty much anything that you expect from an Azure perspective. If I look into one of my virtual machines, it's immediately going to provide me that security optimization view. So what I see here is I have 6 active recommendations, and I got more details over here, where for each and one of them, it's going to highlight, is it a medium or a low risk? I don't have any alerts yet, and I could validate like what kind of applications am I running, and then also if I have them, pulling up any specific information about potential secrets. Back to my recommendations, this is where it starts with that posture experience, like giving you a view on what's going on or maybe wrong in your environment, where now I could move through each and every of these steps. So let's say machines should have vulnerability findings. So what this means is that now we're actually going to mitigate and investigate the problem. Without drilling down on any specifics, because obviously this is slightly depending on what the vulnerability could look like, but it's going to provide you options with obviously, first of all, an explanation. You can like exempt, silence the alert, like thanks for notifying me, but I'm not going to fix it, or I don't need to know about this. And then you could also identify the owner and a due date, like out of the overall security compliance guidelines. There is interaction with Graph. And what this means is that you can actually create a little diagram, and it's not super impressive in my setup because I don't have like a lot of connectivity to the server, but it's going to show me information about the server. It's allowing me to pull up insights and giving me information about my security vulnerabilities. So in this case, it's an application on my app, by coincidence, Google Chrome, where it recommends me to move up because of that known vulnerability. This would be the same for all other resources. Now, another security capability we have is if we move into workload protection, we can enable just-in-time virtual machine access. Now, what is just-in-time VM access? It's an option that comes from the paid version of Defender for Cloud, and it's going to allow you to, instead of directly allowing remote desktop or SSH remote connectivity to a server, that you first need to like ask for permission. So showing you a bit what that looks like. If I jump to one of my servers that I used before and I go into Connect, you're going to see that now we do have just-in-time access as a connection option. So again, what this means is that I need to request just-in-time, and this typically takes about a minute, where after that, it's going to validate if I can use remote access to my server. And since we talked about network settings, I can actually show you what's going to happen next. Out of that just-in-time access, it's now injecting a dynamic rule with a low number, which means a high priority for my Defender for Cloud just-in-time. So this is like a one-time exception, you could say, but you have to request it every single time, where you're going to allow RDP to the server, but not all the time. So that I showed you already quite some features, but let me take a step back to my Defender. Where I can navigate to regulatory compliance. And this is where what I talked about in the presentation, you have other compliance regulations that you can bring in. I didn't import any specific ones like the ones I mentioned, like HIPAA or PCI or ISO 27001, but by default, you have the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. And what it's going to do here is based on the MITRE attack and overall security benchmark collections. It's going to identify all your recommendations that I showed you earlier, but now mapping them with the benchmark categories. And then obviously it's going to highlight like these are all the policies we're going to validate and what is their compliance status, which could be again green, which means all is fine. Or if I open up one of my other options, in like a data protection, data encryption, you can see that some of my environments could probably use quite some updates from a security perspective. So not the deep dive on Defender for Cloud, but hopefully in these 6-7 minutes, I managed to show you at least some of the features, what it means to start actually protecting, managing the security state of your environment together with compliance. With that, let's go back to the presentation. Good, that all worked, but it's only one part of the story. What do I mean by that? Defender for Cloud gives you that security posture. Like it's going to look into your Azure environment and hybrid on-prem or even again AWS or Google Cloud, and it's going to give you that high-level view of your security state. Next to that, it also gives you the capability to run a quick fix, fixing the problem like mitigating, remediating, but you're still in control. For quite some time, like I would say the first 10 something years in Azure, that was probably more than good enough. But then we also have something that we call SIEM and SOAR in the industry. So what is SIEM? It's Security Incident Management. Typically imagine an easy example. Your environment is a victim of a cyber attack. A lot of virtual machines getting infected, DDoS attacks are happening. Like there's so much going wrong in your environment. And obviously like all the red lights start flashing up. To get a view on that, like it's not just getting a security state view anymore out of Defender for Cloud, but now you want to get a more in-depth view. That's really what Sentinel is for. So the SIEM part is that security incident management. And then next to that, we also talk about SOAR. So that's the security orchestration solution. What it means is start with step number one, getting a clear view. It's going to highlight like, oh, something's wrong with your servers. And yes, anything else in Azure if you want, but that's a bit off topic for our AZ-801, right? But it's going to highlight X amount of events. Like in this screenshot, we got 8 million events happening in just a couple of hours. And we can see a trend like that little red arrow going down where the events are, I don't know, slowing down. Maybe the whole environment is already infected and we cannot get more infected. And from there, we can reduce it to 63 different alerts. So what this means is reducing the noise, which I remember out of my consulting days before I became a full-time trainer, that was always challenging. Like again, there's a cyber attack going on and all servers are flashing red lights up where you go like, well, we need to get control on this. But then you also find out that all those servers are all reporting the same security events. But now, how do you filter all that noise? And that's also what Sentinel is doing. And then next to that, translating them into 160 incidents. And again, just an example screenshot. It's not based on a live environment. I don't even have this in my demo environment, but you could probably use your imagination, like 8 million events on X amount of servers, reducing to 63 alerts, like filtering the noise, and then transforming that into 160 incidents. And then on the right-hand side, it's really about getting a view where, by the way, there's also an integration with MITRE attack, like that global standard, you could say, on security, cyber security attacks. And we create that modeling where you could go to the MITRE attack open source website, trying to find out like this specific event that happens in my environment relates to this kind of cyber attack listed in the Mitter database, but now you don't have to check back because it's already embedded in the Sentinel platform. So in short, I described SIEM and SOAR. So SIEM is security incident management, like mainly getting a view, getting a good eye on what's happening in your environment, and then also analyzing the logging data. That's really the source of the analysis. And then from there, once you have that clear view, like what's happening and mainly what's going wrong in my environment, you're going to rely on the SOAR capabilities, and that's that security orchestration, allowing you to really manage, orchestrate the analysis. And a lot of it is reactive and proactive now. So reactive means that you could wait for something to happen, where now you could also proactive, like assuming that maybe a cyber attack is going to happen at some point in time, and then running hunting, which basically means running specific precautions, looking for a problem if it's going to show up in your environment before it actually is going to break and impact your environment. That's the main thing. Good. We're still in our security mindset, managing our Azure virtual machines, where I guess we cannot really talk about security of a virtual machine if we're not touching on updates. So what this next section here in this module is going to cover is Azure Update Manager. A lot of options here as a learning objective, but in short, it's one topic really focused on Azure Update Manager. So with that, what is Azure Update Manager? Again, if you were here since the start of the course, we talked about WSUS, like Windows Software Update Services, and that's that service that's been around for a lot of years, allowing you to implement, install in your own environment, where you define what kind of updates am I bringing in from the Microsoft Update Service, and then controlled in a test environment first, and then moving it into your production environment. Well, now you move your virtual machines into Azure out of a migration. Maybe you deploy new virtual machines in Azure, and obviously you still need to manage the updates. An important part of managing or deploying Azure virtual machines is that you're still in control. Microsoft is not managing your servers. We're not going to patch the servers for you. Now, you could integrate WSUS that you have been running in your on-prem environment for maybe quite some years. You could actually bring in those servers into your, or Azure servers, bring it into your WSUS. But at the same time, as you might remember from the other module, WSUS is still live, it's still supported, but it's not getting updated anymore. Which is kind of funny for an update service, right? Not getting updated, but that's a little joke there. Now, what it means is that out of the platform, talking about Azure, Microsoft provide a similar capability, 100% identical to what WSUS is and used to be doing for your servers, but now part of the Azure platform. So in short, how does it work? And I got a couple of slides on this, but I'm not going to spend too much time, quite some screenshots, but you already know that I like showing stuff to make things even more clear than just talking about them. But in short, it's really that virtual machine running in Azure Update Manager. You enable the service in the platform. You don't need to install it on a server, which would be another benefit. And then also important, you can bring in Azure virtual machines. That would be the default. But you could also create that bridge. That's where I personally like the name Azure Arc. It's that bridging service that allows you to now slightly migrate your on-prem or hybrid running virtual machines into some sort of an Azure management topology. I describe it as you managing a non-Azure virtual machine as if it's an Azure virtual machine. It shows up, you can manage a lot of it, but it's not running in Azure. That's the main thing. One of those capabilities out of Azure Arc integration is now that your hybrid VMs also become available to Azure Update Manager. So this is the screenshot, what it looks like. And I would say if you're a little bit, only just a little bit familiar with the interfacing, the Azure portal, it's just following all those standards. You got those pie charts, you got an immediate view, which virtual machines are already up to date, which ones are ready to install updates. Like the whole management is happening from within the same interface. Update Manager, as you can imagine, it's primarily built to allow you to install, configure the installation of your updates towards your virtual machines in Azure and hybrid. So it's going to allow you to check for updates. Based on that Microsoft Update service, it's going to continuously validate like, oh, there's a new update every, I don't know, every week, every 2 weeks, maybe every day. That's up to you to configure. And next to that, you can define what kind of updates do I want you to check for. Like, is it firmware updates? Is it software updates? Is it security updates? So you can control, you can govern all of that. And then from there, you're going to start identifying and targeting, deploying the updates to your servers. So this is a bit what the architecture looks like. Already talked about the hybrid topology. So in the upper left corner, we got our firewall. It's all encrypted, all secured, pretty straightforward. You deploy Azure Update Manager using a virtual machine extension. So what this means is that every Azure virtual machine that you run, obviously in Azure, you're going to use that update, like the older, you could say, WSS is now getting replaced with that Update Manager extension, like a little plugin that gets installed on the virtual machine. From there, the virtual machine starts reporting, polling, like, hey, Update Manager, do you have any updates for me? And if so, based on the policies, based on the settings, it's going to install the ones that you allow to be installed. Whether the VM is running in Azure or the VM is running on-prem or maybe in some other hybrid cloud environment, the concept is exactly the same. The main driver behind this, I would say, is remember WSS still there, but not 100% updated and supported anymore. This would literally be the Azure cloud alternative to keep an update manager in play, because your life is not changing just by moving to Azure. You still need to patch your servers. And that's mainly what that service is about. A little bit on the lower level, it also means that there is a specific Azure Update Manager role-based access permission. So what this means is that you need to hand out specific permissions to the virtual machine, making sure that it can connect to that Update Manager service. For the hybrid ones, you have that Azure Arc-enabled server concept, and that's where you need to assign the Azure Connected Machine Resource Administrator role. I only got one slide on RBAC, but I would say if you're thinking more about becoming that full Azure management or Azure admin, right, then definitely spend a little bit more time on the Learn platform. Maybe sign up for an Azure 104, that's an Azure Administrator course, to learn a lot more about role-based access. I talked a lot. I showed you a lot of screenshots. I'm going to jump to my demo environment where I'm just going to show you what Azure Automation Manager actually looks like. I'm going to start with describing a bit Azure Update Manager, like what's the interface like, showing you how to review unpatched, semi-patched, and maybe fully patched servers, how to check for the pending updates, and then eventually running an update of a virtual machine together. So this demo is all about Azure Update Manager. And again, the good thing is that you don't have to install like a server application like the WSS we talked about before. This is already part of the platform. So you don't need to deploy anything. So you would just search for Azure Update Manager, and that's going to bring you into this part of the portal. So just giving you a quick view of some of the capabilities and how it works. So first we have our overview section where it's going to tell you how many servers are getting monitored. And as you can see already here, I have my Azure virtual machines, 15 of them, and also my hybrid VMs where I got 2 Arc-enabled servers running in my imaginary on-prem environment. It's going to show me in a quick view what is the status of my machines. So out of the 17, I have 3 pending updates and then 14 with no update information, and then the same information but slightly presented differently. Where it becomes more relevant, I would say, is obviously once we start drilling down. So I picked 3 of my servers, and from here I can immediately select one of my servers, or I can take a step back, and then it's going to highlight me what are the pending updates. So let's check back what the updates are about. And you can see here, it's going to bring me back to my server view, where inside operations, you can immediately jump to updates. So you got two different scenarios now. Instead of always going back to Update Manager, you could also manage it straight from within the virtual machine itself. And then obviously the last piece of information about updates in this section is what are the actual updates. You can force updates like check for newer ones, perform a one-time update, or define schedules. So this is a schedule where now we have again two options. We can define a schedule specifically for one server, or you could define it for a group of servers. So in this case, it's all servers as my guest, reboot if required, define a scheduling time. So quite convenient, and again, not too different from other update management scenarios. Now, if I take a step back to my update manager, I can move on with the configuration, defining actions. So I select the server, and then I can pinpoint any of these options. And then also talked about is the Graph Explorer using custom query language. Now, this could look like a pretty complex, if you look here at this little view, it's a pretty hefty, but it's reading out all information about my virtual machine environment. So maybe not the first query you're going to use, but that's where Resource Graph Explorer is actually quite intuitive and helping you to just select information on the site and allowing you to pull up like details from DevOps environment, databases, container instances. So if I move to compute, grab all my virtual machine images that I have, it's going to allow me to bring that into my scoping of Graph as well. So in short, Update Manager, part of the platform, not too heavy to configure, just following I would say, the straightforward logical scenario. And then the other option is validating the actual updates or checking the update state from within the virtual machine perspective. So with that, let's move back to the presentation for the next section. Good, we're almost there, but this is the next section in this module, where now it's about disk encryption using BitLocker. I'm always surprised when I see BitLocker in our training courses, in our presentations, because my assumption is that BitLocker has been around for so long, and it's part of every Windows device that you deploy, whether it's on-prem, whether it's a laptop, a virtual machine, doesn't matter anymore, and it's already part of that operating system. So why do we talk about it? Yet again, to emphasize that, first of all, you should encrypt your virtual machines if you're not already doing that, and the way to do that is BitLocker. By the way, if you come in with like a Linux background, it's the dmcrypt from the Microsoft Windows platform, if you have that Linux background. So in short, a couple of slides here, not that many, but what we're going to talk about is the importance of disk encryption. I'm pretty sure I don't need a lot of time for that. Next to that, how does it work in Azure? Because Azure is already using encryption. Where is that difference between Microsoft or your partner maybe telling you like, yeah, but everything in Azure is already encrypted. Like, why would you need to worry about BitLocker in your virtual machine environment? Talking a bit about all the topology dependencies around it, which means Key Vault. It's our secret store where you're going to store the encryption keys for the encryption, right? And then how to actually encrypt the disk that a virtual machine is using. And on top of that, talking a bit about how to manage that backup restore if your disk is encrypted, because we need to make sure that we can still touch the data in a controlled way. That's the different sections we're going to cover. So let's start with the basics. When you deploy a virtual machine in Azure, out of the Azure perspective, it is encrypted. Now you still have the option to go into the virtual machine layer, like the Windows Server layer, and enabling disk encryption yourself. The way to do that, again, no surprise, it's BitLocker. And again, if you come in with the Linux background, it's the alternative to dmcrypt, which you might already know of. You have the server-side encryption, which means that you deploy your server. We talk about generation 2, like that's a little bit pointing to the hypervisor, Hyper-V versions, where you got Azure virtual machines running on some sort of a Azure Hyper-V-alike scenario, and it just means it's the latest version that we have, and the full server will be encrypted. And the cool thing is, it's just there, it's automatically done. The side component, it's not just about enabling BitLocker, but it's also about storing my encryption keys. So that's where we position Key Vault. Now, Key Vault is not just there for disk encryption, it's our overall Azure secret store, which means if later on you deploy application services, if you deploy databases, instead of storing connection keys as part of your application, which by the way you should never do as a developer, it means that now you could store those secrets, connection strings, passwords, anything like that, even certificates in Key Vault. And you're going to tell your application, like, these are not the actual credentials, but I want you to go out and find them in Key Vault. That's really what we're doing here. Once you got all that in place, you can look into automation. When we think about automation, it typically means it's probably PowerShell. Now, in this case, since we talk about Azure, you can actually choose. That's why we show you two examples here, how to enable virtual machine BitLocker encryption within the operating system using Azure CLI, Azure Command Line, or the second option, PowerShell, just to help all sorts of admins. If you have that Linux-alike Bash background in scripting experience, then you probably tend to use Azure CLI. If you have that traditional Windows admin background, then you probably look into PowerShell. Doesn't really matter, not all that important. Good news is that you can manage it in a more automated, scripted, friendly approach. And then the backup restore, again, two other slides. What it means is helping you a little bit with that concern, like, oh my God, my virtual machine is encrypted, my data is encrypted, can I still backup my servers? Good news is, of course, you can backup your encrypted servers. There is full support out of Azure Backup, which is covered in one of the other AZ-801 modules that you might find on the same platform here. Good thing is, for the backup capability like Azure Backup Services, it doesn't really matter. You select a virtual machine, you enable backup, and that's pretty much it. And then obviously when you can backup something, you also need to have the option to restore. And that's mainly what this slide is about. Little outsider or maybe a focus point is, up till now I always talked about encrypting the server. But technically what we're actually doing is also giving you an option to encrypt a disk. It also means that when you can encrypt it, you might need a use case to also decrypt it, like removing the encryption. That's mainly what we're doing here. Same as before, Azure CLI option, PowerShell option, or maybe even easier if it's the first time ever you have to do this, or it's like a one-time shot, then maybe not looking into automating everything with scripts. Just go in the portal, select the VM, go to the settings, and then select the disk and make sure you pick the decrypt option and encrypt if you want to turn it around. This is the end of this module where high level it was all about securing Windows Server on-prem and hybrid, where this specific module was the hybrid one, focusing on implementing security solutions. Again, covered quite a lot of content, quite a lot of services. Started with network security, NSGs, Azure Firewall were the prime topics, auditing security using the Defender for Cloud together with Sentinel. We talked about Azure Update Manager, how to patch your servers, hybrid ones, cloud running Azure ones, all that not too important anymore for now. Just keep Azure Update Manager in the back of your mind. And then last, touching a little bit on the BitLocker disk encryption aspect. What does it take to manage the encryption of my Azure running virtual machines? With that, I would like to thank you for having been here with me for this specific module, but it's not the last one. We got a few more modules to cover. So I would also like to invite you to just join me to our next module and helping you becoming a better hybrid Azure virtual machine admin. Thanks for this one and see you back in a little bit.